Hello everyone, welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight we will talk about whether consciousness remains active under heavy sedation. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we explore a question that sits right at the edge of science, mystery, and the strange experiences that happen when your awareness slips away into a state that feels like sleep, but is not sleep at all. Because heavy sedation is something different, something deeper, stranger, and in some ways more unsettling. Most people imagine going under sedation as a kind of instant blackout. One moment you're awake, listening to the beeping of monitors or chatting with a nurse, and the next moment you're opening your eyes again, surprised to find that time has passed at all. Many people describe it as if the world simply flickered on and off, like a light switch. No dreams, no drifting thoughts, no sensations, no passage of seconds. It's as if the universe stopped existing and then quietly resumed its rhythm when you returned. But is that really what happens? Does consciousness truly vanish? Or does something quieter, deeper, and more subtle continue beneath the surface? The question is fascinating because it forces us to confront what consciousness actually is. Not just the bright, active awareness we feel when we're thinking or talking or noticing our surroundings, but the more mysterious forms of awareness that may still be present even when everything seems dark. There are moments in life where your consciousness seems to dim, soften, or retreat. Under anesthesia, under deep meditation, in certain phases of sleep, during intense daydreaming, or when the mind switches modes unexpectedly. We treat consciousness as if it's all or nothing, like someone is either awake or they're not. But biology rarely works with such clean lines. And when you dig into the neuroscience of sedation, you find something surprising. The mind is not a simple machine that shuts off. It's a whole constellation of processes, some of which may keep flickering even when your awareness seems completely gone. Think about how strange it is that you can be sedated for 2 hours and wake up feeling like not a single moment passed. Time itself disappears. You don't feel yourself fading. You don't feel yourself returning. You are simply there, and then later you are there again. That gap in between feels like nothing, but the absence of memory does not automatically mean the absence of consciousness. There are many experiences that you live through that you don't remember at all. Entire hours of childhood, dreams that slipped from your mind before you even opened your eyes, conversations you had while half asleep, even moments where you responded to someone automatically without later recalling that you did. So, what does that mean for sedation? Is the blank space truly blank, or is it simply hidden from recall? Some patients under heavy sedation respond to voices. They squeeze hands, twitch, or react to certain stimuli. Not all, of course, but enough to raise the question: something is still active. Something is still processing. Something is still receiving signals from the outside world, even though the conscious mind is absent. But what does absent actually mean? Are you absent, or are you simply disconnected from the ability to create memories? Sedatives often disrupt memory formation before they disrupt the deeper layers of consciousness itself. It's possible that someone under sedation hears a voice, feels a touch, or senses movement, but the memories evaporate before they're ever stored. Even stranger, there are people who report hearing conversations during surgeries. They didn't feel pain and they couldn't respond, but they remember fragments of what the doctors said, sometimes dramas, jokes, or instructions. Not hallucinated, but real. And when these rare cases are studied, researchers discover that certain parts of the brain remain active during sedation, even when the patient appears entirely unresponsive awareness, not full awareness, not focused attention, but a low hum of processing, a kind of shadow consciousness, may still be there. Imagine consciousness as a series of lights in a vast city at night. In full wakefulness, the whole city is lit, buildings glowing, streets alive, windows shining, neon signs flickering. Under light sedation or drowsiness, many of the lights go out, leaving only certain neighborhoods illuminated. Under heavy sedation, the city goes dark, at least from above. But deep inside, scattered lights may still glow in basements, tunnels, or tiny rooms. You may not see them from the outside, you may not remember them later, but they are still there, doing quiet work. One of the strangest parts of sedation is the way people often describe their return to awareness. There's no sensation of climbing back up through layers of consciousness. You don't feel yourself becoming more awake the way you do when you rise from sleep. Instead, everything snaps back at once. For many, it feels as if awareness begins mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-sentence. You come back online in an instant, as if consciousness was paused and then resumed, like a computer waking from a deep system standby rather than a soft reboot. But if consciousness were truly paused, wouldn't that imply it can be turned off completely? Wouldn't that mean you can exist in a state of non-existence and then reappear without any continuity? The mind doesn't like this idea. Something deep in us insists that we must be experiencing something, even if we don't remember it. The mind craves continuity. The self feels like a constant stream, even when memory is interrupted. And the question becomes more unsettling the more you puzzle over it. Is consciousness something that can stop, or is it simply something that can fall silent? There's a theory that under heavy sedation, your consciousness becomes extremely inward. Instead of processing the outside world, it withdraws into a state so minimal, so pure, that it feels like absolute nothingness. Not unconsciousness, but a form of awareness without content. A blank awareness. No thoughts, no images, no sensations, no time. Just a low-level hum of existence. A simple I am with nothing attached to it. A kind of raw presence without any activity inside it. Some meditators claim to briefly touch this state during deep practice. They describe a moment where the mind becomes empty but still awake, existing without a narrative, without memory, without identity, not asleep, not dreaming, not thinking, just being. And when people describe this, scientists notice something interesting. The brain signatures look surprisingly similar to certain phases of heavy sedation. The mind is quiet, deeply still, but not fully gone. But here's where the mystery deepens. If you were conscious in that minimal, blank way during sedation, how would you know? If nothing happened in that state, no thoughts, no perceptions, no memories, how could you recall it? You only remember experiences that leave some imprint in your mind, but a blank state leaves none. Imagine looking at a black screen for 2 hours and then being asked what you saw. You'd say nothing, even though you were technically experiencing that nothingness the entire time. Sedation may operate in a similar way. Another layer of mystery emerges when you consider that anesthesia is not the same as sleep, even though the two are often compared. During sleep, your brain cycles through patterns. It drifts through stages. You dream, you twitch, you process memories, you wander through strange stories. Under sedation, those cycles stop. Dreams don't unfold, mental imagery doesn't arise, the brain's rhythms flatten into states you never normally enter. You are not drifting, you are held. And yet something still watches. Something still receives input, even if it cannot respond or remember. The unconscious mind hears sounds. It monitors pain. It interprets threats. It follows voices. It registers the world even when the conscious mind is suspended. It makes decisions on your behalf. The decision to move a muscle away from harm, the decision to increase your heart rate, the decision to release hormones. Consciousness is only one layer of an incredibly deep system. The idea that consciousness might be active under heavy sedation forces us to rethink what consciousness even means. If consciousness is solely the bright, clear experience you have when you're thinking, then maybe sedation turns it off. But if consciousness includes the quiet, background processes that continue regardless of memory or awareness, then sedation might merely cover them like a blanket. And then there's the question of identity. If you experience nothing under sedation, not even dreams or images, what happens to your sense of self? When you return, you feel like the same person, the same mind, the same continuous being. The thread of your existence resumes effortlessly, but that thread had a gap, an empty spot. The story of you skipped a chapter, and yet you feel no distress about it. The mind quietly patches over the hole as if to say, you didn't miss anything important. But is that true? Imagine if your consciousness, reduced to its quietest form, drifted in a place beyond memory. Not a place with images or thoughts, but a state of pure potential, like a dim light deep inside a cave. And when sedation releases you, that light brightens again, spreading through the cave until it fills your entire inner world. To you, it feels instantaneous, but perhaps the transition was gradual. Perhaps that quiet light flickered, shifted, and strengthened before you fully opened your eyes. It's also possible that your consciousness under heavy sedation is like a computer running in low power mode. The main screen is off. The keyboard doesn't respond, but the system is still working in the background, quietly maintaining itself, monitoring vitals, managing memory, and running necessary programs. When the system fully wakes, it doesn't remember what it did during that low power state. It only knows that the blackout felt absolute. Some researchers even propose that consciousness is not something that disappears under sedation, but something that becomes inaccessible, like a room in your mind that's still lit, but the door's locked. When the sedation wears off, you unlock the door and step back inside, unaware that anything was happening behind it. This idea is controversial, but it aligns with subtle brain patterns that seem too coordinated to be simple unconscious noise. What fascinates people most is that sedation reveals something unusual about consciousness. It is incredibly robust. Even when you push it down, quiet it, disconnect it, and suppress memory, it still tends to reassemble itself perfectly afterward. You don't wake up missing part of your identity. You don't wake up confused about who you are. You don't wake up with your personality altered. Consciousness snaps back into place with astonishing precision, like a program that never truly turned off, only paused its display. And so the question remains, if you truly vanish during sedation, how do you return so seamlessly? How does something that wasn't there reappear without any disorientation or rebuilding? Maybe you never fully vanished. Maybe you simply went quiet, sinking into a level so deep that your usual awareness couldn't follow. To understand whether consciousness stays active under heavy sedation, we have to look at what actually happens inside the brain when the chemicals begin to take effect. Most sedatives work not by shutting off the brain, but by changing the balance of signals flowing through it. The brain normally operates like a vast conversation, billions of neurons talking, responding, asking questions, sending messages. Sedation doesn't silence that conversation completely. Instead, it overwhelms the system with calming signals, reducing the brain's ability to pass information in the ways required for conscious thought. But the deeper processes, the more primitive layers of awareness, those don't disappear. They simply retreat into the background. The first thing that happens when sedation begins is a shift in how different parts of the brain communicate. The higher regions responsible for attention, memory, and self-reflection start dropping offline. They don't shut down entirely, but begin to lose coherence. Imagine a busy city suddenly losing its power grid. Streetlights flicker. Some neighborhoods go dark, but emergency systems stay running, powered by backup generators. The city hasn't vanished, it's just quieter, less connected, harder to navigate. Your brain under sedation resembles that city, still functioning in certain deep, necessary ways, but unable to produce the organized experience you normally call consciousness. This is why people often still react physically to certain stimuli, even though they report no awareness afterward. A sound might make them shift slightly. A voice might cause their heart rate to change. These reactions reveal that the brain is still processing information. It's still alive to the world. But the conscious mind, the part of you that narrates, remembers, and interprets, cannot access or store what's happening. It's like the brain is receiving the world, but has nowhere to send the information. The roads are closed. One of the most fascinating aspects of heavy sedation is how differently each brain responds. Some people are extremely sensitive, slipping into deep sedation with minimal drugs. Others require much larger doses to achieve the same effect. There are rare cases where people maintain a surprising degree of inner awareness despite being fully sedated. They often describe hearing voices, feeling touches, or experiencing vague impressions of the surgery room, but being unable to move or respond. Their consciousness is still present, but trapped behind a barrier too dense to break through. These experiences are unsettling, yet they demonstrate that consciousness is not always extinguished so easily. But what about the typical case, the one most people experience? No memory, no awareness, no sense of time passing. Even in these cases, the brain leaves subtle footprints that suggest something was happening behind the scenes. Brainwaves don't flatline under sedation, they simply change their patterns. Activity becomes more predictable, more synchronized, more rhythmic. Instead of the chaotic dance of wakefulness, sedation produces a slow, pulsing hum, and that hum hints at a state that is not fully unconscious, but not fully conscious, either a liminal zone, a borderland. Imagine drifting down into the deepest part of a lake. On the surface, waves crash, sunlight sparkles, boats cut through the water, but far below, everything is calm. Pressure builds around you, but the environment becomes uniform, muted, steady. Sensations slow, sounds become muffled, vision fades to darkness, yet you're not gone. You are simply elsewhere, experiencing the world in a different way. Heavy sedation feels something like this to the brain, a descent into stillness. There's a theory called the disconnected consciousness hypothesis. It proposes that consciousness does not vanish under sedation, but instead becomes isolated from sensory input and memory formation, like being awake inside a sealed chamber where nothing enters and nothing leaves. No information comes in, no memories go out. The mind, in this view, is still running, but without access to the world, it becomes empty. Not dead, not off, just disconnected. Another theory suggests that consciousness pulses during sedation, flickering in and out like a faulty signal. It might come online for a moment, sense something faintly, then fall offline again. These tiny bursts of awareness may be too brief or too fragmented to form memories, but they could still exist, like sparks of light in a dark room. If this is true, you may have been aware for microseconds during surgery, aware in ways so thin and fleeting, they never coalesced into anything you could recall. Some neuroscientists propose that consciousness requires three ingredients: awareness, attention, and memory. Under heavy sedation, memory is the first ingredient to vanish. Even if awareness briefly survives, it has no way to record its experiences. It's like writing on water. Thoughts dissolve as soon as they form. Without memory, consciousness becomes a shapeless moment, forever erased. Attention is the next ingredient to fade. Sedation weakens the brain's ability to focus or organize perceptions. Even if stimuli reach the brain, attention can't latch onto them. You may hear something without knowing you heard it. You may sense pressure without recognizing it as sensation. Without attention, awareness becomes fuzzy, drifting. And finally, awareness itself dims. Not instantly, but gradually, like a light turning down on a dimmer switch. There is no sudden disappearance. It's more like a controlled descent. Awareness narrows, shrinks, slips into the background. But even at its dimmest, a small pilot light of consciousness might still be burning. One of the most mysterious aspects of sedation is the complete loss of time. When you're awake, your brain constantly tracks the flow of moments. It builds a timeline of events. Even during sleep, your brain has a rough sense of time because your internal clock keeps ticking. Dreams stretch and compress time, but your mind still feels a rhythm beneath them. Under heavy sedation, that rhythm is suspended. The sense of duration dissolves. To your conscious mind, the period simply never existed, but time still exists for your brain. Heartbeats still occur, the clock still ticks, neurons still fire. You undergo real biological experiences during that period. Your body moves through time, even if your mind does not. This creates a strange duality. The person who wakes up feels like no time has passed, but the body has lived through a real interval. The self wakes into a moment that their body has already lived. This divide raises a question. If consciousness was truly absent, why does the return to awareness feel so smooth? If you vanished completely, wouldn't returning feel like a jolt? Wouldn't there be a sense of discontinuity, a moment of confusion about where you were? Instead, most people wake with perfect clarity, aware of who they are, where they are, and what they were doing before the sedation. It feels as though the mind simply resumes its story, like a book briefly closed and then reopened. Perhaps consciousness, even when muted, maintains enough coherence to preserve a sense of self, even if it cannot form memories. It's possible that identity is more durable than awareness, persisting even in the deepest state. The you that wakes up may not be the same as the you that was active during sedation, and yet they share the same blueprint, the same sense of continuity. The feeling of seamlessness may be an illusion created by the brain to stabilize your understanding of yourself. Consider how your mind behaves during extremely deep meditation or moments of intense focus. Sometimes you lose track of time completely. You forget your surroundings, you forget yourself. You drift into a space where thoughts momentarily stop. There is no memory of that space, yet you never feel like you ceased to exist. You simply return. Perhaps sedation induces a similar kind of state, but deeper, quieter, more uniform. Or think about the moments right before sleep. You may have experienced times where your thoughts trail off, breaking into fragments. Images fade, sounds distort. The boundary between awareness and unconsciousness blurs. You don't remember the transition. It just happens. Sedation exaggerates this effect, extending it into a profound stillness that feels infinite but is actually finite. And because the transition back to wakefulness is abrupt, it creates the illusion that nothing occurred in between. But suppose there is something happening in the silence, something subtle. Perhaps the brain is still forming faint impressions, shadows of thoughts, tiny sparks of activity. Perhaps these sparks never form memories, never reach awareness, never translate into experience, but they might still exist as micro experiences, lost instantly. In recent years, artificial intelligence and neural simulations have given researchers tools to model what consciousness might look like at the edge of awareness. These simulations show that when networks are heavily suppressed, they don't go dead. They fall into simple, repeating patterns. Loops. They fire in minimalist structures that don't generate a story, but still produce internal states. If the brain behaves similarly under sedation, consciousness could exist in a simplified, content-free form, a kind of quiet murmur beneath the silence. In that murmur, there may be a faint sense of being, not thoughts, not perceptions, not sensations, just existence without narrative, a pure moment of presence that leaves no trace. If you were conscious in that way, you would have no way of knowing it afterward. The experience would be erased the instant it passed. Your memory would restart only once sedation lifted, and so you would conclude that nothing happened. But a lack of recall and a lack of experience are not the same thing. Some people describe strange feelings right before they go under. A drifting sensation, a moment where their thoughts scatter like leaves, a sense of being pulled inward, as if falling through the center of their mind. These subjective impressions hint at a transition that is not instantaneous. The descent feels like slipping deeper into oneself, like the world fading into the background. If consciousness were truly extinguished instantly, such transitions would not occur. And then there are the rare moments when people come out of sedation unexpectedly. They aren't fully present, but they can whisper, squeeze hands, or open their eyes vaguely. They don't remember doing so, yet the behavior itself shows that some part of the mind is active enough to respond. These glimpses reveal the complexity of sedation. They show that different layers of consciousness fade at different times. Some layers remain long after others disappear. The idea that consciousness is binary, on or off, is too simple to capture this nuance. Heavy sedation turns the mind into a landscape with many levels. Some levels shut down early, others persist, and the deepest levels, the primitive awareness that senses threat, monitors the body, regulates emotion, those may never fully turn off. They are ancient, tied to survival. They watch even when the higher mind is silent. The question then becomes, if those deeper layers are still awake, is that consciousness? Or is consciousness only the part of the mind that notices itself? Some definitions say consciousness requires self-awareness. Under sedation, self-awareness is gone, but awareness may not be. Does a candle stop being a candle when its flame is small, or is it still the same thing, just in a quieter form? The sense of I feels stable in everyday life. You don't continuously question who you are or whether you exist. You simply move through the world with an unbroken thread of identity. But that thread is far more dynamic than it seems, and sedation exposes just how fragile and flexible it can be. Consider the moments right before you fully wake in the morning. For a few seconds, you may know nothing. No name, no place, no history. Awareness surfaces first, identity second. It's as if consciousness has to reload the idea of who you are. Sedation exaggerates this phenomenon. It seems to pause the self, placing identity in a kind of suspended animation. When people reawaken, they often feel as though their identity reassembled instantly. But in reality, the mind is performing a fast, complex reconstruction behind the scenes. This reconstruction is fascinating because it implies that consciousness might not be a single stream, but a network of processes that can shut down and restart independently under heavy sedation. The processes that give rise to memory and narrative collapse early, while more primal forms of awareness linger. These primal layers don't need a sense of self to operate. They function without intention or story. And this raises an important question. Can consciousness exist without the I attached? Some philosophers argue yes. Consciousness doesn't need to be personal to exist. You could have experiences without tying them to a self. Imagine seeing colors or hearing sounds without thinking, I am the one experiencing this. A raw, impersonal awareness. Under sedation, if any consciousness remains, it might resemble this impersonal form, not tied to your identity, not creating memories, not shaping thoughts, a type of awareness that exists without ownership. One of the most intriguing clues comes from people who undergo sedation, but later recall dreamlike sensations. Not full dreams, but vague fragments, floating, drifting, a sense of being held or suspended. These aren't common, but they show up often enough to raise questions. If heavy sedation truly erases all consciousness, why do these impressions emerge? They might be hallucinations occurring during the transition in or out of sedation, or they might be glimpses of what happens in the deep interior of the mind when normal awareness is suppressed. A kind of symbolic translation of the brain's descent. Neuroscientists studying these reports have found that the brain sometimes enters unusual patterns during sedation, patterns that are not seen in normal sleep or wakefulness. The boundary between perception and imagination blurs. The mind, deprived of external input, may generate sensations from its internal activity. These sensations could be experienced as drifting or floating. They don't form coherent stories, but they hint at an inner world that doesn't fully disappear. To understand whether consciousness persists, we can also look at how sedation interacts with memory. Memory formation is one of the first systems to go offline. Even mild sedatives begin interfering with the brain's ability to encode new experiences. This is why people often forget conversations they had while sedated, even when they seemed awake at the time. Without memory, a conscious moment vanishes instantly, leaving no trace. It's not that the moment didn't happen, it simply never became part of your story. A curious example of this is procedural memory, the type of memory that allows you to learn physical skills like playing an instrument or riding a bike. Under certain types of moderate sedation, people can continue performing learned tasks with surprising accuracy, even if they later have no idea they were doing it. The conscious mind is heavily dampened, but the deeper layers that store and execute patterns of behavior remain active. This suggests that consciousness is not a single entity, but a stack of processes that can operate independently. Imagine a building with many floors. The top floors contain your self-awareness, your reflective thinking, your identity. The middle floors handle perception, attention, and decision-making. The bottom floors manage instinct, reflex, and basic emotional reactions. Under sedation, the top floors go dark almost immediately, but the lower floors may keep humming. They're still processing input, maintaining your body, responding to stimuli. You may not have access to these floors, but they haven't disappeared. So the question becomes, does consciousness belong only to the top floors? If consciousness includes self-awareness, then sedation likely shuts it down. But if consciousness includes the deeper forms, the subtle sense of presence, the raw registration of the world, then some part of it may remain active, operating silently in the background. There's another angle worth considering: the default mode network, a collection of brain regions associated with introspection, daydreaming, and the sense of self under heavy sedation. This network typically becomes quiet. It doesn't shut off entirely, but its connections weaken. This leads to a state where the brain is less self-oriented and more internally passive. Without the default mode network, the mind loses its narrative structure. You aren't thinking about yourself, your memories, your future, your surroundings. You are simply existing in a kind of open state. But when sedation lifts, the default mode network reactivates quickly. It snaps back into place, re-establishing your narrative, your self-concept, your identity. And because this reconstruction feels immediate, you assume nothing happened during the gap. But this assumption might overlook something fundamental. Consciousness might be less about what you experience and more about the transitions between states. Consider the transitions you've gone through in your life without conscious memory. When you were a newborn, your first experiences likely left no lasting trace. You lived through days and nights before forming stable memories, but you don't think of those periods as empty. They were part of your development, even though they're inaccessible now. If consciousness existed, then without the ability to remember it, why couldn't something similar occur under sedation? Another curious clue comes from people who emerge from sedation feeling emotionally changed. They can't explain why, but they wake with a sense of calm, or sadness, or confusion, or relief. These emotional states don't appear randomly. The emotional centers of the brain remain partially active during sedation, processing internal signals, regulating stress, responding to medications. It's possible that unconscious emotional experiences occur during the sedation period and shape your mood once you wake up. Even if you don't recall anything, this suggests that some internal processing continues, influencing your subjective experience after the fact. There's also the strange phenomenon of implicit learning under sedation. In rare cases, people can pick up patterns or emotional associations while deeply sedated, without having any conscious experience of learning them. A word spoken repeatedly during sedation might influence their choices later. A gentle tone of voice might reduce anxiety upon waking. These subtle shifts imply that the brain is not shut down, but still receiving input in some form. This raises a profound question. If your brain can learn during sedation, even without memory or awareness, Is that learning occurring in a conscious or unconscious way? And what is the boundary between these categories? Sedation blurs the line. It shows that learning, processing, sensation, and perception can persist even when your conscious mind is disconnected. It suggests that consciousness, as we define it in everyday life, may be a thin layer resting on top of a far more complex foundation. Imagine consciousness as the visible tip of an iceberg. Under sedation, the tip sinks beneath the water, becoming unseen. But the rest of the iceberg remains, vast and intricate. The visible part disappears, but the structure underneath still exists, supporting everything that allows you to return as yourself. Now let's consider the moments just before people wake from sedation. They often describe a feeling of appearing, not rising from darkness, not climbing through layers, just appearing, as though consciousness came back in a single snap. But what if this is an illusion caused by the sudden restoration of memory and narrative? What if the mind actually reassembles itself gradually in the seconds before wakefulness, rebuilding awareness piece by piece, only giving you access once everything is in place? You don't notice the reconstruction because you aren't fully online yet. You only become aware once the system has reached stability. This idea becomes even more intriguing when you think about the concept of microconsciousness. Some researchers propose that consciousness may not be a continuous stream, but rather a series of rapid pulses. Under sedation, these pulses may slow dramatically, becoming so infrequent that they fail to produce the sense of continuity required for conscious experience. It's like a movie played at 1 frame per minute. You would perceive nothing coherent, even though individual frames still exist. If sedation slows consciousness in this way, you may experience micro moments of awareness that are too sparse to form memories or coherent thoughts. This perspective redefines unconsciousness not as the absence of experience, but as experience that is too fragmented to be recognized. The moments could be there, but too isolated to form a narrative. And without narrative, awareness slips into emptiness. Sedation therefore occupies a strange middle ground. It is not wakefulness, not sleep, not dreaming, not death. It is a unique state where the usual structures that support consciousness are rearranged. Sensory input is filtered, memory is disconnected, narrative is dismantled, identity is suspended. And yet beneath all this, the brain continues to operate, to interpret, to respond. This complexity makes sedation one of the most fascinating windows into consciousness because it shows just how much of consciousness is invisible to you, how much of your inner world operates without your knowledge, how much happens behind the curtain. And it suggests that the self you experience day to day is only one version of your mind, one that depends on memory, attention, and interpretation. Remove those layers, and something simpler may remain. One of the most revealing ways to understand consciousness under heavy sedation is to compare it to states that look similar on the surface, but operate very differently beneath it. Sleep, fainting, daydreaming, deep meditation, sensory deprivation. These states each involve a shift in awareness, but none replicate what sedation does. They help highlight what is unique about the sedated mind. Take fainting, for instance. Fainting appears like a sudden loss of consciousness, much like the flicker people describe under anesthesia, but fainting results from a rapid drop in blood flow to the brain. It's not a controlled shutdown, it's more like a power outage. There's no smooth descent. The brain simply loses the energy needed to sustain awareness. When consciousness returns, people often feel disoriented, confused, or emotionally rattled. Heavy sedation rarely causes that. People wake from sedation feeling strangely refreshed or neutral, as if nothing significant happened. This contrast hints that sedation doesn't suspend consciousness in the same abrupt way fainting does. Instead, it seems to guide consciousness into a specific, structured state, one with its own patterns and rules. Meditation provides a different comparison. In deep meditation, the sense of self dissolves. Thoughts fade, The mind becomes quiet, expansive, or sometimes entirely still. Some meditators describe moments where the boundary between themselves and the world disappears, leaving only pure awareness, no thoughts, no emotions, no sensations. This sounds eerily similar to what some scientists think might survive under sedation, a pure, minimal awareness without content. But meditation is intentional. The person guides themselves into that state. Under sedation, the mind is guided by chemicals, not will. Yet both share a quieting of the brain's internal chatter, a stilling of narrative, a suspension of identity. If meditation can reveal a level of consciousness that is content-free, perhaps sedation pushes the mind into a similar territory, but more involuntarily. Another useful comparison is sensory deprivation. In total darkness and silence, with minimal sensory input, the brain begins to generate its own stimuli. People see shapes, flashes, or drifting imagery. They hear faint tones. The mind hates a vacuum. It fills silence with its own voice. Under heavy sedation, sensory channels are muted, but not necessarily entirely cut off. The mind might be drifting in something like an internal void, except unlike sensory deprivation, the brain's ability to imagine, project, and create is suppressed. So instead of hallucinating or generating new content, the mind might simply settle into a quiet blankness. This is why some researchers argue that sedation creates a content-free but preserved state of consciousness, a state where the mind exists but doesn't do much. It's like a computer that's powered on, but with the screen off, no windows open, no processes running except the bare minimum. In such a state, awareness may not actively experience anything. It exists but remains dormant. But perhaps the most illuminating comparison is dreaming. Dreaming shows how vivid consciousness can be, even when disconnected from the external world. In dreams, you experience sights, sounds, emotions, stories, yet none of them come from the outside. They are generated entirely within. The brain creates entire worlds out of nothing. Under sedation, this system, responsible for generating internal imagery, shuts down more completely. This is why sedation feels like nothingness rather than the surreal landscapes of dreams. Not because consciousness is gone, but because the machinery that produces dream content is offline. And this helps explain something subtle. Content and consciousness are not the same. You can have consciousness with no content, pure presence. You can have content with no self-awareness, as in some dreams. Sedation might eliminate content but spare a glimmer of consciousness. That glimmer might be so faint and so empty that it leaves no trace, but its existence cannot be ruled out just because you don't remember it. Another way to think about the sedated mind is as a vast room filled with lights. Under normal conditions, all the lights glow. They represent thought, memory, emotion, perception. Sedation dims the lights one by one. Some lights go out quickly. Memory, attention, the sense of self. Others fade more slowly. Sensory processing, basic awareness. The deepest, most primal lights may never go out entirely. They flicker at low intensity, maintaining a minimal awareness that isn't connected to anything meaningful. When sedation lifts, the lights come back on rapidly, and because the room is instantly bright again, you don't notice which lights had gone dim or what was happening in the darkness. To see how complex this can be, consider the brain's response to sound under sedation. In many cases, the auditory system continues processing sound waves, sending them into the brain as electrical signals. The early stages of processing, distinguishing pitch, recognizing patterns, may still occur, but the information never makes it high enough to enter consciousness or memory. It's like hearing a whisper at the far end of a cave, a whisper that never reaches the central chamber. Yet the mere fact that the whisper is processed at all suggests that the mind is not fully dormant. This is why some people recall hearing fragments of conversations while under sedation. These memories are rare, but they exist. suggesting that the boundary between unconsciousness and awareness during sedation is thinner than we think. When these fragments appear, they almost always lack emotional or narrative structure. People don't remember being afraid or curious or confused. They simply recall a phrase or two floating in the void. This supports the idea that content can leak into a minimal consciousness, even if the later stages of interpretation are offline. Then there's the fascinating link between anesthesia and personal identity. If consciousness disappears entirely, one might expect identity, your sense of being a specific individual, to be disrupted. Yet people wake from sedation with perfect continuity. They don't question who they are. They don't need to rebuild their personality. They simply step back into themselves. This might seem trivial, but it's profoundly mysterious. It suggests that the self is stored in something more stable than awareness, something that can persist even when attention, memory, and perception are disrupted. This deeper layer of identity may be what psychologists call proto-consciousness, the foundation upon which more complex awareness is built. Proto-consciousness doesn't require thoughts. It doesn't require narrative. It's the basic sense of existence that everything else relies on. Sedation may suppress the upper layers, but leave this foundation intact. And when the higher layers restart, they reattach to the foundation effortlessly. Another surprising clue comes from how the brain behaves during intraoperative awareness. Those rare cases where someone becomes partially conscious during surgery, these events show that consciousness can rise and fall unpredictably under sedation. The brain can dip into deeper states and then float upward into awareness without warning. And when it rises, it never rises all at once. Some systems activate before others. The person might have awareness but no ability to move sensation without interpretation, hearing without context. These experiences reveal how layered consciousness truly is, how different parts can wake at different times, and they imply that even during deepest sedation, some layers might still flicker. To understand how the self remains intact despite these fluctuations, it helps to think of identity as a pattern rather than a thing. You don't store your identity in one spot in the brain. You are the sum of countless interconnected processes. Your memories, your emotions, your skills, your beliefs, your habits. Sedation interrupts some of these processes, but not all. The core pattern, who you are, remains stable. So when you return, the pattern reactivates effortlessly as if no time has passed. This stability might explain why the transition out of sedation feels instant. The mind prefers stories that make sense. If there is a gap in your narrative, the brain fills it in with silence. The story simply jumps from one moment to the next. You don't question it. The brain doesn't like unexplained breaks in identity, so it smooths them over. This smoothing creates the illusion of non-experience. It turns a period of potential minimal awareness into a blank. The stability of identity also reveals something about the nature of consciousness itself. Consciousness depends heavily on the brain's ability to integrate information. During wakefulness, this integration is seamless. Sights, sounds, thoughts, memories all merge into a single flow. Sedation disrupts integration. It doesn't necessarily eliminate the information, it just prevents the system from combining it into a coherent experience. Without integration, consciousness becomes fragmented or silent, but fragmentation is not the same as annihilation. In fact, some researchers argue that consciousness may consist of countless small islands of activity. During wakefulness, the islands connect to form a continent, the full, rich experience of the world. Under sedation, the bridges between islands collapse. The islands remain, but they no longer form a unified whole. If true, then consciousness under sedation might be like scattered fireflies blinking in the dark, brief sparks of awareness that never form a pattern. It's also worth considering how sedation affects time perception. Your conscious mind loses all sense of duration, but your brain continues marking time at a biological level. Hormones rise and fall, neurons fire in rhythmic patterns. Your internal clock continues ticking. This creates a split between biological time and experiential time. Biological time continues uninterrupted. Experiential time collapses. This discrepancy shows that experience is not rooted in biology alone. It requires interpretation. And under sedation, interpretation is the first thing to go. So what remains? A quiet version of the self, a presence waiting in the wings, awareness without story, identity without memory, a mind reduced to its most essential core. Sedation doesn't just flatten awareness, it raises deeper questions about what awareness even is, what makes it vanish, and what makes it return. It forces us to ask where you go when you're not experiencing anything. And perhaps most intriguingly, it shows us that the boundary between experience and non-experience might be far more flexible than we assume. Let's start with one of the oldest and most persistent questions in philosophy. Does consciousness require continuous experience? Many people assume that if you're not experiencing anything, you're not conscious. Sedation challenges that assumption. It creates a state where the mind may still exist, where some form of awareness might persist, yet there's nothing happening inside it. No narrative, no images, no sensations. It's a form of consciousness that is neither awake nor asleep, neither active nor extinguished. It sits in the middle, quiet and contentless. Think about the idea of the self. Most of the time, you experience the self as a continuous flow. Thoughts string together, emotions rise and fall, memories connect one moment to the next. Sedation interrupts that flow. But that interruption doesn't destroy the self. It simply pauses the stream. When the chemicals lift, the self returns instantly, as if the interval were irrelevant. This tells us that the essence of identity isn't located inside moment-to-moment consciousness. It's stored in the structures that continue running even when consciousness is suppressed. In philosophy, this leads to an intriguing question. If the self can exist without conscious experience, then what is consciousness for? Why do you need awareness at all? If identity persists, if the body continues functioning, if the brain maintains its structure, then what role does experience serve? One idea is that consciousness acts as an integrator. It pulls together disparate information to help you navigate the world, make decisions, and respond to danger. Under sedation, integration is disabled. The system goes into a safe mode. This raises an important point. Sedation doesn't remove consciousness to protect you. It removes consciousness because conscious integration requires too much neural coordination, which sedation temporarily dismantles. But the framework of the self waits beneath that dismantling, intact and untouched. Another philosophical puzzle is the nature of memory. When you wake up from sedation, you have no recollection of the experience. But lack of memory doesn't prove lack of experience. We know from dreams, for example, that people can have full, vivid experiences that disappear within seconds of waking. You could have dreamed for hours and not remember any of it. So the question becomes, is sedation actually a blank space? Or is it a state filled with content you simply can't recall? Scientists tend to assume it's a blank, but philosophers argue the opposite. No memory does not necessarily mean nothing occurred. Sedation prevents memory formation, but it might not prevent experience. Some experiences might simply fail to write themselves into memory because the chemical environment disrupts the machinery needed to store them. This raises an even more curious idea. Perhaps there were thoughts during sedation, quiet, shapeless ones, that vanished instantly upon waking. Perhaps the mind drifted in a fog-like awareness it could never hold on to. If this were true, then waking after sedation would be like waking from a dream. You forgot the instant your eyes opened, there was something there, but it slipped out of reach. But there's more. Sedation also opens up questions about the boundaries of time and experience. If you don't sense time passing, did it pass? From your perspective, the moment you close your eyes is the same moment you open them. Minutes, hours, they vanish from your personal timeline. Your physical body lives through that time. Your brain continues functioning, but the you that experiences time disappears. This creates two timelines. The biological one marches on. The experiential one pauses completely. And when the pause ends, you pick up your narrative right where it left off. This reveals something profound. Consciousness is not required for time to exist, but it is required for time to be felt. Without awareness, time becomes irrelevant. It becomes a feature of the world, not of the mind. Sedation places you in a state where time does not apply to your internal experience. And this has led some philosophers to wonder whether consciousness itself might be less tied to time than we assume. Under sedation, your body experiences time, but you vanish from it. What does that say about the nature of personal continuity? One possible answer is that continuity arises from structure rather than experience. Your identity is like a pattern carved into your brain. When sedation turns off awareness, the pattern remains. When consciousness returns, it reattaches to the pattern effortlessly. There is no sense of disjunction because the pattern, the blueprint of you, never changed. Consciousness is simply the light shining through the blueprint. Turning off the light doesn't alter the drawing. Turning it back on reveals it exactly as it was. This leads to another mystery. If the self remains intact, while consciousness is offline, then the self is not identical to consciousness. They are linked, but distinct. Consciousness may simply be the experience of the self operating. The self is the structure. Consciousness is the activation of that structure. Sedation disables the activation, but leaves the structure untouched. To explore this further, think about a computer. When you put it into sleep mode, everything goes dark. No windows are open, no tasks are running, no signals appear, but the underlying state of the system is preserved. All the files, settings, and configurations remain exactly where they were. When you wake the computer, it returns to life instantly. The screen lights up, the tasks resume, the system continues as if no time passed. Sedation doesn't put your brain into sleep mode. It's more like a controlled suspension of the processes that create experience. But the metaphor still reveals something important. The self is stored in the system's architecture, not in the active process. Conscious experience is the active process, but identity is the architecture. This raises a question that stretches beyond science. Where is consciousness located? Not physically, but functionally. If it can turn off without harming identity, then consciousness may be a layer rather than the core, a temporary state rather than the foundation, a tool rather than the essence. And yet consciousness still feels like the essence. After all, without awareness, you don't experience anything, not even your own existence. Sedation reveals that the universe can keep going without your awareness. But your awareness can also return without the universe needing your permission. This line between being and not being, between presence and absence, is thinner under sedation than almost anywhere else. Then there's the question of whether consciousness under sedation might resemble certain altered states that people voluntarily explore. Deep meditation, dreamless sleep, sensory dissolution, or moments of intense focus. The absence of content in these states doesn't mean the absence of awareness. Many meditators say they reach a point where awareness exists without thought, emotion, or self-sedation might artificially induce something similar, though stripped of intention or insight. If contentless awareness can occur during meditation, why not during sedation? The mechanism differs, but the end result might have more in common than we expect. If this is true, then perhaps sedation isn't a void. Perhaps it is a state of existence without narrative, a state where the mind is present, but nothing is happening within it, a kind of stillness at the edge of consciousness. Of course, there's a counter-argument. Maybe sedation truly eliminates consciousness. Maybe all those brain signals are just mechanical processes with no awareness attached. Maybe the lights go fully out. This position is called the global unconsciousness theory. It argues that sedation dismantles the networks necessary for awareness so thoroughly that no experience, even minimal, remains. According to this view, the moment sedation takes effect, consciousness ceases. It doesn't hide, it doesn't shrink, it simply stops. But even if this were true, sedation still raises an extraordinary question. How does something as complex as consciousness stop and restart so cleanly? How can the entirety of your inner world collapse instantly and then reappear seconds or hours later, fully intact? It's like turning off an entire universe and then turning it back on without any damage. That seamless restoration suggests that consciousness may not be as fragile as it appears. It might be more like a system with built-in resilience, capable of pausing and rebooting without losing integrity. This also brings up the concept of phenomenal gaps, another philosophical idea. A phenomenal gap is a period where conscious experience does not occur, yet your identity and biological existence persist. Sedation is a clear phenomenal gap. But so is dreamless sleep. So is the moment before you're born. So is the moment after you die, depending on one's worldview. Sedation gives you a glimpse into what non-experience feels like, which is to say, it doesn't feel like anything at all. And that's the strange part. The absence of consciousness is not an experience of nothingness. It is the absence of experience. Philosophers sometimes compare this to turning off a light in a windowless room. Once the light is off, there is no darkness to perceive. There is simply no perception at all. Sedation might recreate that condition, a state where perception does not occur, but the potential for perception remains within the structure of the mind. This brings us to another fascinating angle: potential consciousness. Even when awareness is offline, the potential for awareness remains embedded in the brain. Sedation doesn't erase the brain's ability to generate experience. It temporarily disables it, but the potential sites quietly, waiting to reactivate. This potential might be the true essence of consciousness. Not the content, not the flow of thoughts, but the capacity to experience anything at all. Some philosophers believe consciousness is not the experience itself, but the capacity for experience. Sedation supports this view because it shows that experience can stop while the capacity remains. When the chemicals lift, the capacity returns to operation instantly, as though it had been paused mid-motion. This perspective reframes consciousness as something deeper, something that exists even in the silent spaces where nothing is being experienced. This raises one last profound question. If consciousness can exist as a capacity, even when content disappears, then maybe we misunderstand what shutting down the mind really means. Maybe sedation doesn't turn off the mind at all. Maybe it turns off the content while leaving the capacity intact. And maybe that capacity, existing quietly beneath the surface, is the thread that keeps the self continuous. As we reach the final stretch of this exploration, the focus shifts to what heavy sedation ultimately teaches us about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. It acts almost like a magnifying glass held up to the edges of awareness, revealing where the mind stops, where it hides, and where it quietly persists, even when it seems completely gone. Sedation is not just a clinical experience, it's a doorway into deeper questions about existence, identity, and what it means for the mind to be active, dormant, or suspended somewhere in between. When you think about what it feels like to go under, the transition is almost too abrupt to analyze. One moment you're lying on a bed, talking, breathing, listening to voices around you. The next moment, everything is gone. Not even darkness remains because darkness is still an experience. The absence is so complete that you don't even register it as absence. And in that instant, you witness something that is difficult to explain: the ability of consciousness to disappear from your view without creating any sense of loss or discomfort. Most states of awareness involve some kind of transition. Falling asleep brings drifting thoughts, hazy dreams, subtle sensations of sinking or floating. Even waking up feels like rising from one world into another. But heavy sedation feels like stepping through a missing frame in a movie. There's no transition, no bridge, no descent, just a gap. And that gap says something important about how consciousness can stop. Not gradually, but instantly. Yet despite how absolute this feels, your consciousness never emerges damaged on the other side. It returns fully formed, with all your memories, identity, personality, and history still intact. Everything you've ever experienced, everyone you love, every habit and preference, none of it gets erased by sedation. This resilience tells us that consciousness may be fragile in its moment to moment expression, but the architecture beneath it is incredibly stable. It suggests that consciousness might be more like a temporary projection of deeper systems, rather than the deeper systems themselves. What makes this so fascinating is that sedation helps strip away illusions about what consciousness needs in order to function. We assume awareness depends on ongoing experience, memory, and attention. But sedation shows that awareness is something that can vanish entirely and still return without losing coherence. This reveals consciousness as something dynamic and flexible, more like a state your brain can enter and exit, rather than a continuous stream that must always be flowing. And then there's the strange truth that during sedation, your perception of time dissolves. For your physical body, time marches on as usual. Heart rate, temperature, biological clocks, metabolic cycles all continue in their normal rhythms. But your inner experience stops recognizing time altogether. You have no sense of passing minutes or hours. The space of your awareness collapses into a single moment. This teaches us something profound about how tightly personal experience is tied to time. Your awareness is what turns time into something you feel. Without it, time becomes something that happens around you, not to you. This separation between biological time and experiential time raises a philosophical question. If time can pass without you knowing it, then what does it mean for experience to be real? Sedation shows that real things can happen to your body, even to your brain, without producing any experience at all. You might be moved, spoken to, medically treated, or monitored, yet none of it becomes part of your personal story. It all unfolds outside your conscious narrative, and when consciousness resurfaces, it does so without needing to reconcile what happened in the gap. The idea of a gap where experience doesn't occur is deeply strange because it points toward a world that continues even when you're not participating in it. This leads to a fascinating philosophical insight. Personal existence is not the same as conscious experience. Your existence continues even when your awareness does not. You are still there, even when you, the experiential self, is nowhere to be found. This challenges the common idea that awareness equals existence. Sedation separates the two cleanly and elegantly. Another layer to consider is the relationship between sedation and sensory perception. Even when consciousness is heavily suppressed, some sensory pathways continue functioning. Sound may still be processed at basic levels. Touch might reach the brain without reaching awareness. These inputs move through neural circuits like signals traveling through a silent city at night, seen by no one, noticed by no one, leaving no record behind. This background activity suggests that the internal world does not shut down completely. It simply becomes inaccessible to the self. And yet, because these signals don't integrate into a conscious experience, they feel non-existent from your perspective. This opens the door to another idea. Maybe consciousness is defined not by what the brain does, but by what the brain allows you to perceive. The filtering and gating of information is arguably as important as the generation of experienced sedation closes these gates extremely effectively. Nothing gets through to the upper layers where meaning, narrative, identity, and awareness live. In many ways, sedation shows how much of your inner life is a construction built on fragile foundations. When those foundations are suppressed, the construction collapses. not permanently, but temporarily, and the ease with which the mind rebuilds itself afterward hints that the blueprint of the self is stored somewhere deeper than experience. It may be encoded in the organizational structure of the brain, in the stable patterns that persist even when the lights are out. Think for a moment about consciousness as a kind of spotlight. When the spotlight is on, it illuminates thoughts, perceptions, memories, feelings. Anything that lands in its beam becomes part of your awareness. When the spotlight is off, those things may still exist in some form, but you can't perceive them. Sedation doesn't destroy the objects in the room, it simply turns off the light. And when the light returns, the objects are exactly where you left them. The continuity remains even though you experience none of the intervening moments. This metaphor helps make sense of one of the most enigmatic aspects of sedation: the complete lack of subjective time. If the spotlight is off, there is nothing to illuminate time's passage, no moments appear, no sequence unfolds. When the light comes back, the mind simply resumes where it left off, unaware that anything was paused at all. It's the closest thing we have to a demonstration that consciousness may not require continuity to remain coherent. It can turn off and on like a switch, and the self remains unbroken. Another striking insight from heavy sedation is how clearly it separates memory from experience. Under normal conditions, memory and conscious perception work together. You perceive something, and if it matters enough, you remember it. But under sedation, even if tiny sparks of awareness do occur, they are unable to turn into memories. The system that records your experiences temporarily goes offline. This raises the question: if you have a conscious moment that you cannot remember, did it truly happen? Most would say yes. After all, you forget many dreams, but that doesn't mean you didn't dream. Sedation might operate similarly. There could be fragments of awareness that slip through but vanish instantly, leaving no trace. Some people report hearing muffled voices or sensing that something was happening around them, even though they were deeply sedated. These rare flickers hint at a boundary that isn't as impenetrable as it seems. They imply that consciousness might not disappear entirely, but instead retreat into a minimal, fragile form, like a candle flame reduced to a barely visible glow. Not enough to form memories, not enough to assemble a coherent experience, but still there, faintly observing. This possibility brings us back to a profound idea. Maybe consciousness is not an all or nothing state. Maybe it exists on a spectrum that ranges from full, vivid awareness to a quiet, nearly invisible presence that dissolves as soon as it arises. Sedation might move you nearly to the bottom of that spectrum without reaching absolute zero. And when you awaken, the higher layers return so quickly that you assume nothing was occurring at all. And then comes the final lingering question: what does sedation teach us about death? Not in a dramatic or fearful way, but in a curious observational one. Sedation shows that the mind can disappear from your subjective experience without causing fear, panic, or discomfort. It shows that awareness can stop without suffering. It shows that a person can exist without experiencing themselves for a period of time. This doesn't answer any ultimate questions, of course, but it reveals something calming. The absence of experience is not painful. It's not frightening. It's simply absence. And yet, unlike death, sedation always carries a return. When you come back, your awareness flicks on like a light that was never broken. You return to the narrative of your life effortlessly. You rejoin the world as if no time passed. This return teaches us something encouraging about the mind's durability. It suggests that consciousness is not a fragile flame that flickers out permanently at the slightest disruption. It is something that can be paused, dimmed, quieted, and yet spring back to life the moment the conditions are right. This entire journey, from the descent into nothingness to the seamless return, reveals that consciousness is both delicate and resilient. It can vanish instantly, but it can also rebuild instantly. It can leave no trace of where it went, and yet it can step back into your life as if it never left at all. Heavy sedation is a reminder that the mind is far more intricate than we realize, operating on levels we rarely witness, shaped by forces we are only beginning to understand. And now, as your mind winds down from this exploration, let this final thought settle gently. Sedation shows us that consciousness is not defined by its moments of silence, but by its incredible ability to return. It reveals that awareness may dim and disappear, but the structure that holds your identity remains steady and waiting. And in that waiting, there is something quietly reassuring.